This panel is going to talk more broadly about different kinds of approaches to these issues that we see across the world. And one of the things, I'll just sort of preview this a tiny bit, we're really going to be spanning the globe. And you're going to hear a lot about very different legal frameworks. So in Europe, for example, as you'll hear, it tends to be a more highly regulated place from a legal standpoint than the United States. You will also hear about different ideas that are going on in developing countries, which again, when we talk about global solutions, and we've heard so much about the interplay of these issues across borders, we need to be thoughtful about how all of these different places knit together and how all these legal approaches knit together. And to lead this fascinating panel, it's my privilege to introduce you to one of my partners, Rasha Shields.
Thank you so much, Laura. Hello, everyone. I'm Rasha Shields. I'm a partner in the Los Angeles office of Jones Day and also a former criminal prosecutor in Los Angeles. And as we all know, and as Rita Katz's presentation made very clear on the first day of this summit, is that hate has no borders, so our solutions can't either. And that's why we're here at a global summit, and also why this panel is so important. And of course, many of our programs have to be implemented at a very local level, but we need to share information globally. What's out there, what's working, what's not working, how can governments better coordinate with each other, and also how can governments build these coalitions of all of the stakeholders and do so strategically, working with civil society and the social media platforms. And thankfully, we have a great panel here of global experts to be able to talk about these issues. And I'll go through and introduce them very quickly. Jessica White is a research fellow in the Terrorism and Conflict Group at the Royal United Services Institute in London. And fun fact, before she completed her PhD, she spent 6 years as an intelligence analyst in the US Army. Then we have Tori Bjørgo, who, did I do it close? Okay, who's a professor at the University of Oslo and director of its Center for Research and Extremism, the Extreme Right, Hate Crime, and Political Violence. Then we have Louisa Klingvall, who's the team leader in the Fundamental Rights Unit of the European Commission Directorate-General for Justice and Consumers Unit. Then we have Alina Bricman, who's the director of EU Affairs at B'nai B'rith International. And finally, Robin Taylor, who's the executive director of Lawyers Without Borders. Thank you all for being here, and especially for all of you who had to travel internationally during this very difficult time. So Jessica, I'm gonna start with you, and I think we need a clicker. Do we have a clicker? Thank you. You know, Jessica, you've spent a significant amount of time researching the effectiveness of different programs across the globe in preventing and combating extremism and violent extremism. Can you set the landscape for us as to what's out there, what's working and what's not working?
Yeah, thanks, Rasha. So, like I said, I mean, this is sort of my team. This is a team effort, years of work that I've been involved in, but not want to take credit for all of it. We've done 2 reviews of sort of preventing and countering violent extremism programming, and I'm going to make a distinction here because I think one of the problems with going on the last day, the last panel, is that a lot of this stuff has already been said, right? A lot of these things have been raised already. So the distinction between these 2 projects is one that sort of, for the prevention project, we looked at over 550 different pieces of evidence or reviews of programming. That's not to say that there was 550 programs, but different people had written about some of the same programs. And then for the second one I'll show you is actually a systematic review. As Rick was saying in the last panel yesterday, I think it was, sort of a more, we looked through thousands of pieces of material, and it really ended up with about 30 or 40, things that were we concluded were actually evidence, so that went into these systematic reviews. And I think that's an important point to raise, sort of to bring out the state of evidence on this type of programming is still lacking. It's still sort of lacking in process, a lot of it, and then sort of the quality of a lot of what we do have as evidence is needs to be improved, I think we can say. So the prevention project it happened over a couple of years. Like I said, it was about 550 pieces of literature that we reviewed, and we ended up with several papers on different topics of different types of interventions. So one on women-centric interventions, one on PCVE communications, one on education initiatives, mentorship interventions, and then one looking at this relationship between youth and VE, or violent extremism. And there's there's very individual recommendations that came out of each of those themes, but then there was some cross-cutting lessons learned. And because we're very limited on time, I'll try and pick out a couple that maybe are new or sort of raising on points that people have already talked about, but adding something to those. And I think one thing to say is, as we think about preventing and countering violent extremism, often it is happening in a very limited time frame on a limited budget. You're expected to address social, inequalities, drivers of extremism in a very limited way. And so often people, come along with the suggestion, okay, let's link it to all these other types of programmings. And I think that there are definitely advantages to linking it to wider sets of development programming that's going on, wider education initiatives and all of this. But there's also a danger in that of securitizing programs under a CT framework and bringing them into this conversation about terrorism and, radicalization. So there's definitely complex concepts to think about as you're trying to do that. One of the things sort of we found with the evidence that exists is that sort of what we determined was the most positive evidence was for mentorship interventions. And I'll tell you that is largely because those are very tailored and very integrated interventions where you may be providing multiple different types of support to individuals. And that was sort of the key to their success that we could see, versus some of these other more individualized approaches. The process of engaging in PCVE is very reliant on trust and the actors that are involved in that process. It depends on the context of the location, where you're implementing these programs, but to find actors that have the trust of that community is really a key element to making these things work effectively, I think. As well as, I think, the issue of sustainability. And, if it's only a short program cycle that you have 1 to 3 years, you need to make sure that what you're doing can last in that community after you are gone and your organization has, is maybe no longer funding a program in that area. So I'll go on to, this was the sort of the systematic review of several different types of interventions. And we looked at interventions targeting youth engagement, so PCV interventions that were engaging youth as part of their strategy. We looked at the disengagement sort of realm of prison programming and exit programming that comes after prison, and the national government capacity and law enforcement, or national capacity building on law enforcement. And there was a few themes that came out of this, cross-cutting lessons that were learned. And this is more about the evidence base that you provide and establishing clarity from the outset. We call it theory of change, but a lot of programs lack this sort of understanding from the very beginning of what it is they're trying to achieve and a plan for how it is that they're going to get to that end goal. And we're always saying the theory of change is such an essential part of having an effective program. I think looking at what you're understanding your target group, using a gender lens, thinking about the intersecting differences that are a piece of your target is really essential to making something effective and to being able to design it in a way that is useful. One of the things I always point out too is a lot of preventing and countering violent extremism programming is multidimensional. There are multiple elements happening at one time. And if you don't enable an evaluation of single pieces as well as the sum whole of the program, then you're left unable to determine what was effective and what wasn't out of that program. And I think finally, before I pass on, that the thing to say in investing in the knowledge base is that publishing your failures is just as important as publishing your successes. So nobody wants to admit that they've implemented a program that didn't work well, but ultimately, if you're willing to say what did and didn't work, that helps the next person down the line be able to develop theirs in a more effective way. So, yeah, I'll stop there and I'll...
Thank you, Jessica, for such a very truncated summary. I'm sure there's so much more that we can learn from all of the papers that your team has submitted. But Tori, I'm going to turn it over to you. And one of the lessons learned that Jessica touched on was the importance of building trust and also kind of the sustainability of these programs. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've studied and analyzed in the Nordic countries and how the importance of trust has applied in that collaboration?
Sure. Could I get my slides up there? Yeah, thanks. Well, I've been leading a research project on Nordic approaches to interagency collaboration for handling violent extremism, where we are comparing policies and practices in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And these are for countries that are in many ways very similar, but also there are important differences that have some consequences for interagency collaboration. So why is it useful to collaborate between agencies? And I speak about municipal agencies, I talk about schools, social services, youth workers, health personnel, child welfare authorities, and so on. And first of all, crime and violent extremism are problems that affect the entire community. And the police are not able to handle these issues alone. And police tools are fit to handle the symptoms of these issues, but other agencies have much better tools to address some of the causes of these problems. Why do young people join criminal gangs or extremist groups and so on? Most of these causes are social. And the police do not have the tool to address these issues, but other agencies and professions such as teachers, social workers, health personnel, civil society organizations do have relevant tools. And such interventions may be greatly improved if there is some kind of coordination and collaboration between different agencies with ownership to the problem, to avoid, for example, that the police or youth workers or teachers undermine each other's efforts rather than reinforce each other's work. And this may involve sharing information on youth at risk, what is a problem, and how to coordinate among the different agencies and practitioners on how to intervene and who will do what. And that is a challenge because for several reasons. You see, so I'll say a few words about the policy frameworks and the legal and organizational frameworks that are necessary to facilitate such interagency collaborations. And first of all, there need to be some kind of overarching action plan, a governmental action plan, a policy saying that such collaboration is something we need to do, and at least give some direction how to do that. Also, legislation is important here, both in particular when it comes to legislation regulating confidentiality on sharing information between agencies. There are huge differences between different agencies on confidentiality regulations. Some are much more stricter than others, and there are also important differences between the Nordic countries here. Denmark, for example, has a special law that facilitates exchange of personal information for preventive purposes on young people at risk, specifying that this information cannot be used for criminal investigation purposes, for example. Norway does not have such a law, so they have to find other ways to share information, usually by obtaining consent from parents or the person in question. And Sweden has even stricter regulation than the others. So this makes it difficult, but it's at least challenging. Also, there are important differences in police laws among the Nordic countries, where the Danish and Norwegian police have much stronger mandates for prevention, providing help and care to the public and assistance to other agencies in the case, and more so than is the case with, for example, the Swedish police. And this has great consequences for the roles of the police in interagency collaboration, where the Swedish police is far less involved due to their more limited roles and mandates than is the case with the Danish and Norwegian police, who are heavily involved in collaboration with schools, social services, and civil society organizations. Denmark established something called the SSP system, school, social services, and police, for collaboration starting in the mid-1970s. Norway got something similar in the mid-1980s. the 90s, and Finland got it more recently. And here again, Sweden has not really implemented something at a similar level, more at a kind of strategic level, but not at the how they can work together on individuals. So there is a need to find a common ground here. And traditionally, the police and municipal agencies like social services, schools and health services have highly separate agendas and professional cultures, where the police is focusing on control and law enforcement, and the other agencies are more on social welfare and care. And of course, the police would like to have the social workers and teachers to be the eyes and ears of the police in all these situations, but that is not necessarily a role that social workers and teachers are comfortable with. So there is a need to find a common ground here. And one common ground would be that all these public agencies do have some kind of combination of the role of care and control. Even teachers and doctors, health personnel have mainly a care role, but they have also some level of control role. And the same with the police, although they are mainly in the control business, they also have a caring role. And if that caring role could become some kind of overlapping area where they find a common ground in order to help young people at risk, that may provide a basis for collaboration. And then a very important ingredient here is to build trust. Because this is a sufficient level of trust is a prerequisite for interagency collaboration. And I think it's useful to distinguish between, and first of all here, it's very important that the style of policing is very important here. And we know that is very different in different countries, and that in the US, this has been a big issue, that the police has tended to have a rather aggressive, repressive policing role, whereas, for example, in some of the Nordic countries, a much more caring role has been, and much more service-oriented role has been important. That is providing a different basis for collaboration. In general, I think it's useful to make a distinction between two types of trust: institutional trust and personal trust. And the Nordic countries are characterized by a high level of trust in the police and other governmental institutions, among the public, but also among practitioners. So they tend to have a relatively high trust in each other. And this makes collaboration and information exchange less controversial. But there is also another kind of trust, what we call personal trust, that, for example, teachers and youth workers know that their local police officer is a person that they know well and can be trusted not to misuse sensitive information about a specific youth at risk. And they know that they have a shared agenda with the police officers to help a young person back into a better path in life. And then they can stretch the rules of confidentiality a bit and cut some bureaucratic corners. So trust makes collaborations smoother, and it's kind of the oil in the machinery. Finally, I said we compare the Nordic countries, and we find some significant differences here in their approaches to interagency collaboration, the roles and the logics at play. And some of the policy differences have great consequences for the practice in interagency collaboration. And as I said, stronger mandates for a police role in prevention in Denmark and Norway than in Sweden is very important here, because it makes the police much more involved in this interagency collaboration. Unfortunately, in Sweden, the police have a more marginal role compared to the other countries when it comes to this interagency collaboration. Actually, who is sitting around the table is quite different. And in many situations in Sweden, the more the social services and the school are sitting around the table, and police may only be there now and then. So that is an important dimension here, and also the legislation regulating information exchange and confidentiality, where we see that Denmark has a much broader range of possibilities for exchanging information, whereas it's more restrictive in Sweden. And Norway is somewhere in between, or in Finland is somewhere in between here. I think I stopped there, so yeah.
Thank you so much. I know that this is a lot of material to cover, but and you've talked about how legislature and policies all impact these things. But one thing that really struck me in this talk is about how the trust between police and the communities seem to be at the heart of really good, successful programs. And I hate to say this, but that makes me concerned about the United States, as you kind of mentioned, that not only is the style of policing different, but we've had a kind of a crisis in terms of both institutional and personal trust, and a breakdown of that after the murder of George Floyd. And we even heard on a panel yesterday that some of the private militias have been successful in recruiting active law enforcement. So where does that leave us in the United States in terms of implementing these types of programs where you have to rely on the police? Do we have to first reconcile the police with the communities they serve before we can really get a successful program underway?
Yeah, clearly it's a very challenging situation, and I think it takes a long time to build trust and a very short time to undermine it and destroy it. So that is challenging. I think, and also trust is very unevenly distributed in the population, where some parts of the population may have high trust, typically the middle classes, whereas those who are in more vulnerable socioeconomic situations tend to have less trust, and they have more trouble. So they need the police more, but the trust is not there. I think at least a way to start is to build individual trust. That, for example, there is a community police officer that is able to build trust with teachers and social workers and civil society organization in the community, and that personal bond may overcome a little bit of the institutional trust, but it's a tough way to go.
And the concept of community policing has kind of been tried, or at least is being tried in the United States, but it's a long process. And as you said, even some people might have personal trust in their local person, but not institutional trust. So we really need to work on both of those aspects. And before I turn it over to you, Louisa, I'll stick for one more minute on things that worry me about the United States. And I have to say that when I was preparing for this panel, there are many times that I walked away with more concerns than solutions. But I think that that's exactly why we're all here today, to work on these solutions together. But before the summit, I had the opportunity to interview General Michael Hayden, and he's the retired U.S. Air Force four-star general who previously was the director of the CIA and the NSA. And he talked with me about the major concerns he has with the direction the U.S. has been headed, and particularly about the American political culture moving in the direction of a post-truth reality. And we heard today both Fareed Zakaria and Major Garrett kind of touch on this concept a bit during their keynote speeches. And General Hayden really wanted to be here today, and he may be watching us, so hi, General Hayden. As some of you may know, General Hayden had a massive stroke almost 3 years ago, which left him with a condition called aphasia, and he asked me to share that condition with you to raise awareness. And so, although this condition can impact his speech and his ability to communicate, it doesn't impact his intellect, as you'll see in this video. Can we play the video? General Hayden, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today and for participating in the 2021 Eradicate Hate Global Summit.
Thank you again.
You begin your book, The Assault on Intelligence, American National Security in an Age of Lies, by reminiscing about your time walking through wartime Sarajevo when you were the head of intelligence for U.S. forces in Europe. Can you tell us about that experience and why it led you to conclude that the veneer of civilization is quite thin?
Yes, indeed. Sarajevo was a nice place. It really was. It was very special, I think. And then there was a war going on. And it was a horrible, horrible war. And I walked around Sarajevo and I said, why are these people doing this? Because before, it wasn't a problem. 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, that now it was. And look what happened now to this wonderful place. And then I was thinking about the United States and what's going on now. It's a lot like Sarajevo 10, 20, 30 years ago. And now maybe it's the same thing.
So what do you think we should be doing to try to, protect and kind of defend this thin veneer of civilization?
I talk about the revolution in America, okay? And this thing of enlightenment. And people, I think it's very important. And if we don't do that, then I don't know what's going to happen for America.
And do you have any, helpful things that we should be doing on, in our daily lives to try to get closer to this enlightenment?
Well, yes, indeed. Talk with people. Talk with people. Talk with people. Maybe I don't agree with you, but let's talk about it. But many times we don't want to talk about it. It's just, I'm right and you're wrong, and that's the way it is. And that's not right at all. And I'm worried about it because I think for 10 years, 15 years, going in the wrong direction.
I think that's absolutely an accurate assessment here. And we all kind of see the echo chambers that develop where we just surround ourselves with the people who think that.
That's exactly correct. Let's just talk about COVID. Now, science knows what's going on, but how many people involved don't want to do that? And I'm thinking that we're a good people in the United States, and now it's 10, 20, 30, 40% doing, no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do it. What? Why don't you do that? They're ignoring expertise. That's what's going on.
Yeah, I think, the major distinction you're making is that it's okay to disagree with, an opinion, but it's something much different to say that a fact is not a fact.
Exactly correct. A fact is a fact, and you get with it.
Any last words for the people at the summit?
Critical thinking, and after that, you could say critical thinking, and then finally, critical thinking.
So not just take everything that you see at face value.
That's exactly correct.
Is there anything that keeps you hopeful for, the future of America?
What you're doing right now, okay? That's very important. It's very important because I know what happened in our city 2 or 3 years ago. So that's very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And we know that you are, beloved in Pittsburgh and really a national icon. So thank you for all of your time and thank you for all of your service.
In 1 year, I'll try to go to this conference.
Well, we would love to have you here next year. And we're so sorry we couldn't see you in person. But again, just such an honor for you to be participating and taking the time to be part of the 2021 summit. So thank you again.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. And so now I'm going to switch gears a bit, but even, General Hayden talked about kind of the polarization, the echo chambers, and of course we know that a lot of that, the spreading of hate is even easier online, and the spread of misinformation is easier online. So turning to you, Louisa, you're coming to this discussion from the perspective of the regulator. What do you think the proper role is for regulators in this space, and what are some of the competing rights that you're dealing with, and how do you go about balancing them?
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, just like in the US, protecting human rights, the values of democracy and rule of law sits at the very heart of the European Union's constitution. We have an EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is binding on the EU institutions and on member states when they implement EU law. Article 11 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights protects the right to freedom of expression. But the right to freedom of expression can be limited when justified. It does not prevent states from sanctioning or even criminalizing serious incitement to violence and hatred when directed to groups of persons or individuals based on individual characteristics. So this is why we have laws in Europe that require all the member states to criminalize racist and xenophobic incitement to violence and hatred when this is done in public. It's important to remember that this law does not in any shape or form criminalize speech that is critical to religion or that is simply offensive. We're really talking about incitement to violence and hatred. So we have a criminal law response in relation to those that utter hate speech offline or online. But we also have to work with online intermediaries because, of course, we know that there are millions of pieces of hate speech being spread on online platforms every day. The tools and the mechanisms that online platforms use to moderate content that they host play a major role for how we as citizens and users perceive the world and also how we form our opinions. And opinion formation is also moving more and more online. That's where we interact. Tackling illegal content online is really challenging because these online places have become the new public square. This is where we exchange our information. But still, we have to remember, and it's been said many times before in this summit, that these online platforms, they don't have any human rights obligations to respect. These are private companies. This is a business, and that is, of course, also how they should do their operations. But there is actually no right to freedom of expression on, say, YouTube or Facebook. From the regulatory side, this also makes it tricky because we can push platforms to remove illegal content. We can enforce those kind of laws, at least in Europe. But when doing so, we have to be extremely careful so that we don't push them towards what we call over-removal. So when they start removing content that is actually protected speech. Because as the state, we can never engage in practices where we are pushing the private companies to also remove protected speech. In the EU, we have used a voluntary model to deal with the particular problem of illegal hate speech. And this comes a little bit from the scene setter that we had in 2015. We had terrorist attacks, we had a refugee crisis. The amount of hate speech that we saw online exploded, and there was an urgency in doing something now and immediately. So the European Commission reached out to the major platforms, and they were interested in working with us on this. So in 2016, we presented, together with Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Microsoft, the Code of Conduct on Countering Illegal Hate Speech. And the aim of this Code of Conduct is to make sure that illegal hate speech is effectively assessed and removed by these online platforms when it's notified to them by users. Of course, these were beautiful commitments, but we had to make sure that the platforms also delivered on these commitments. So to measure the responsiveness, we engaged around 30 NGOs all over Europe that work with notifying illegal hate speech to platforms. And during monitoring intervals, they launch a whole number of notifications of illegal hate speech that they find to the platforms. Then they note down what the result and responsiveness was in relation to these notifications. When we first started the monitoring, the results weren't brilliant. The platforms responded by removing the content in 28% of the cases notified that were, prima facie illegal material. However, only 1 year later, that figure was up at around 70%, and it's stabilized there ever since. And here again, I would like to come back to your point of trust. So also in this area, building the trust between civil society, our member states, and the IT companies was a really, really important part of success of this program. The European Commission is also taking action to ensure more broadly that we are able to deal with illegal content online. The Digital Service Act that the Commission proposed in December 2020 will provide new procedures for faster removal of illegal content, but it will also provide robust safeguards for users' online rights. We've heard a lot of discussions in the last couple of days about the need for more transparency, for instance, in the content moderation policies of the platforms. And the Digital Service Act contains a lot of these requirements on platforms. So this is currently being negotiated now with our co-legislator, and we hope, of course, that this will be a successful piece of legislation. Hate is global. It travels across borders. We need to work with our trading partners. The recently launched Trade and Technology Council will serve as a forum for the United States and the EU to coordinate approaches on our digital policies. And there has been one working group created that will exactly look at platforms and their role in the ecosystem. Tackling illegal content and protecting human rights at the same time will be definitely a strong feature of this discussion. And we will exchange on best practices and our experiences in working around these issues, including the voluntary collaboration that we've had at the EU level. And we very much look forward to working with the US on this. And I believe the agenda set is quite ambitious, so let's see in a year's time what has come out of this collaboration. All the policy actions that I have mentioned so far deal with illegal hate speech. But what do we do with speech that is not illegal, but that is still very harmful and prevents a factual and reasoned debate in our societies? This content, no matter how offensive, is protected by the right of freedom of expression, and we cannot order the IT platforms to remove it. We have to use other tools in our toolbox to address this. One of the main advantages of the Code of Conduct, as I said, was a trust-building exercise. And it led to the IT companies and civil society to start collaborating not only on removal of online hate speech, but also on projects to support online civility and counter-narratives that address racism and intolerance. And of course, effective counter-narrative strategies need to be evidence-based, and we need to better understand hatred, where it comes from. And in a nutshell, how does hate speech travel from kind of obscure right-wing extremist forums to all of a sudden appear on my neighbor's or my uncle's Facebook page in a somewhat more polished form? We need to understand how this travels better. So I think we've really had the pleasure during this summit to hear about so much great academic and research work in this field. that really combines computer science, sociology, psychology, to better understand this ecosystem of hatred. And as the regulator, I think we need to fully exploit this knowledge. This is something that we really need to improve at. It is my firm belief that this is a problem that we can tackle, but we have to do it together. The governments, the public authorities, the civil society, the IT platforms, academia and research. We all have to join in on this. I think that the EU and the US face very, very similar challenges, clearly. And we are also two trading blocks that look at this problem from a rights-based approach. So while, of course, there are differences in our approaches, there's also a lot of commonalities. And I believe that we can exchange on this very, very fruitfully in the coming years and learn from each other. I'm certainly taking home a lot of precious knowledge and understanding from this summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louisa. One quick follow-up question, because you had already this voluntary model in place and worked with both the social media platforms and civil society in trying to resolve this, or at least be responsive to illegal content. Did that inform the making of the Digital Services Act?
Absolutely. I mean, a strong feature of the Digital Service Act is to continue voluntary collaboration. So codes of conduct actually has its own legal provision, because it is understood that the law in itself is not going to solve this problem. If we want good content moderation, we need to bring civil society and state authorities together with the IT platforms to inform this difficult discussion that has to be had about what content should reasonably be expected to be removed and what should be left up. So this is definitely something that has informed the whole legislative work that we have done.
And do you think that collaboration has helped both the social media platforms and the civil society understand each other a bit better and understand the difficulties that both have?
Absolutely. I mean, in the beginning, there was a lot of, irritants that we could quickly get rid of. I mean, simply by making sure that civil society partners know exactly what forms to fill out if they want to report a piece of content, did away with a lot of problems. And at the level of the IT platforms, I mean, we have to understand that they have to assess illegal content in a whole range of different cultural and historical contexts and in different languages. So for them to benefit from the expertise of the civil society partners was of great help. Also, what they have told me is that, today, let's not kind of downplay the fact that around 90% of removals today are made using automatized means of detection, so artificial intelligence. But again, these are tools that need to be perfected to be sufficiently granular, not to have many false positives. And there again, the knowledge that came from the civil society partners helped the platforms to better shape these instruments. So there is a kind of continuous positive feedback loop in this collaboration.
Great, thank you. And that turns me over to Alina. You have the perspective of civil society, and what collaborations have you been involved in? What have you seen that's working? And what types of additional collaborations would you like to see in the future?
Well, thank you, Rasha. And as you suggested already, I'm coming to this from a bit of a different perspective, and beyond coming from a civil society perspective, I'm coming from a Jewish communal perspective as well. So that's sort of the angle that I'll be bringing to the conversation. But before I do that, I just want to say how in awe I've been over the past few days of everything that's been put together here. It's been really extraordinary. So it's incredible that Laura, Mark, and the whole team managed to put this together. It's been super impressive. A few of the speakers have kind of touched already upon the different sorts of anti-Semitism we're seeing out there, and just sort of to recapture that a little bit. It's something that moves across the political spectrum. It's fueled by polarization, accelerated by algorithmic augmentation, often resting on Holocaust denial and distortion and trivialization, and really more often than not serving as a foundation to conspiracy ideologies. And as I deal with the European Union specifically, I do want to take a moment and share a little bit about what we're seeing in Europe on the street and online before speaking to the really positive engagement we're seeing on an institutional level. And I think maybe just a bit of personal background can really be illustrative to the reality of Jewish life in Europe. I'm originally from Romania. We're about 5,000 to 8,000 Jews there, of about 1.3 million Jews in all of Europe. That's about the same number as in New York City alone. I was part of the first generation of the only Jewish school in Romania. So for about 10 years, I went to school every day behind a tall fence. I passed a metal detector, I passed security guards, and that's really the case with every Jewish school in Europe, and with every synagogue, and with every community center, which is a great contrast to what we're seeing here. Over the past 10 years, there's been multiple killings. 11 Jews killed in 6 different attacks because they were Jewish. Numerous attacks on synagogues. The attack in Halle, Germany was mentioned, but there was also Göteborg and Malmö and Vienna and Hamburg. Cemetery desecrations are in the dozens. Vandalisms of kosher restaurants and other visibly Jewish venues. Targeting of Holocaust memorials, and the list goes on and sort of encompasses a whole universe of manifestations of anti-Semitism. So in that context, it's easy to understand why European Jews may feel threatened. And just to bring a little bit of data to the table, in 2008, the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency conducted a study to actually see how Jews feel as Jewish Europeans. And about 85% of the 16,000 Jewish Europeans surveyed said that anti-Semitism was actually the most pressing issue that they face on a daily basis. 70% of respondents actually said that they avoid displaying any Jewish symbols. So when we speak of positive advancements, I just want us to have this backdrop in mind. But there is significant progress, and except for the really uplifting Jewish revival we're seeing across many cities in Europe, there is institutional progress as well, and I think Louisa already touched on some important points that translate to the world of tackling anti-Semitism as well. The way I sort of think about it is as a race between elevating the fight against anti-Semitism on a government level and the worrying trends we are seeing on the street and online. So in that race, I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few of the things that have worked. So actually just this month, the European Union has published its first ever strategy to combat anti-Semitism and foster Jewish life. And the first thing I would say about that is that it's really sort of the culmination of 5 years, more or less, of civil society engagement with the European Commission, and a really valuable outcome of a very collaborative approach there. B'nai B'rith, along with some of our other colleagues in Brussels, submitted something like 70 to 80 recommendations, and I think about 60 of these were actually reflected in the final strategy. And I think that already speaks to the fact that the institution was really listening to the community. So I'll just pause on a few points reflected in the strategy. The first of them is data collection. We've all spoken about that. I just want to re-emphasize that by saying we've seen this already work. It has helped elevate the topic on the agenda, and it's already informed a lot of policy. One best practice on this front is that the EU will work with national level agencies to align their data collection methodologies so that data can become a bit more comparable. That goes hand in hand with reporting, again, something that was mentioned many times. I'll just reference the survey I mentioned before. 79% of respondents had not reported even the most serious incident that they faced. So we need to work on building that trust that was mentioned before. I think Jewish community security organizations are part of the answer, but ultimately we should be working to not need to have that intermediary. We heard yesterday about some of the tools that the OSCE is providing to law enforcement, for instance. The European Union will also be cooperating with the European Judicial Training Network and the EU Agency for Law Enforcement Training, or CEPOL, to build their capacity on tackling anti-Semitism. So identifying these relevant networks to partner with, I think, is another significant takeaway. Then one thing that is really striking to me that I find really crucial is the mainstreaming of the fight against anti-Semitism across policy areas. Someone mentioned the word cross-cutting, and I got very alerted, because I think, at least in this field, it's really the word of the day. We see this now addressed in education, in culture, in law enforcement, in counterterrorism, in protection of public spaces, in foreign affairs, and crucially in digital legislation. So we're not going to get rid of that topic with any of the panelists. Ahead of the publication of the Digital Services Act that Louisa just spoke of, B'nai B'rith spearheaded efforts to sort of coagulate a joint Jewish policy response. And as we saw the DSA draft published, we see that indeed the EU is imposing unprecedented accountability mechanisms through reporting, through due diligence obligations, and that's been extremely encouraging for Jewish organizations. But beyond this, we see that the EU is establishing a Europe-wide network of trusted flaggers. It will support capacity of fact-checkers. It will cooperate with industry around Nazi-related memorabilia, and promise to conduct a comprehensive data analysis to understand the spread of hate online. So we saw in the prior tech panels that the issue is really multifaceted, but I'm really excited to see that the European Union is really at the forefront of actually looking at legislative and non-legislative solutions. I will mention just one last thing, which is that I think it's really important that the strategy also has a big focus on positive expressions of Jewish life. I think it's really important to try to move the spotlight from the security aspect to actually celebration of Jewish communities and communities in general, because I think that's where we ultimately need to work in order to eradicate the root causes of the issues we're facing.
Thank you, Alina, both for that context and for all of the positive developments that you're seeing. I think that it's a good, hopeful message to see that there are things that are working. And I'm going to turn it over to Robin. Robin, before you became the executive director of Lawyers Without Borders, you spent most of your career in the U.S. Department of Justice, and a lot of that time spent internationally. Can you talk a little bit about the different roles that you've had, and how, can you give us a concept or a framework so that we can build collaborations more strategically in this area, and lessons you've learned about both how countries can cooperate with each other and how agencies within countries can better cooperate with each other?
Sure. There's a danger in a few things I'm going to say to be said in 5 to 7 minutes, but I'm going to do my best, and if they don't fully translate to the audience, please see me at the break, because I think they do touch on some sensitive topics. I think building on what Alina said, living overseas, my journey, I left the northern part of California for Nairobi, Kenya in 2011 with a 4-year-old, 8-year-old, and 11-year-old. And so my children grew up overseas, following on to Jakarta, Indonesia, then 4 years in Germany. When I landed in Jakarta, I was asked to declare my religion, which I declined to do, not knowing whether that was acceptable or not after my kids were born that there was the death penalty for having drugs possessed, which properly scared them. I then looked up, and there are 21 declared Jews in Indonesia out of 275 million people. The number isn't exactly accurate, and there is some expression of Jewish religion, but what I found in the time I lived overseas wasn't so much anti-Semitism, which I saw in Germany, but was the absence of any understanding of the practice of Judaism. People who had no idea what Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah were, didn't know about any, and they had a similar outlook on Mormonism and other religions. Even Catholic could be quite a marginalized experience, I think, in many parts of where I lived. And so within that context, I'm going to pivot a little bit to what I think maybe we haven't talked about as much in the area of interagency collaboration, and maybe where we can go, certainly with Laura's indulgence. When I was walking to the conference one day this week, I won't say which day, I stopped and talked to one of the Pittsburgh PD officers, because there's 7 cars outside. I've seen them in sort of mosque, keeping us safe. And I asked him what he thought of the topic, and he said, I really think it's critically important. And I said, have you had any? He goes, yeah, of course, the Tree of Life incident was a very disturbing one here. He goes, but we have been asked to stay on our side of the bridge. So we walk over the bridge here. Now, that's not entirely true, because I did see some officers milling about when I came out. But it sort of set the metaphor for me, and I talked to my colleague at Facebook at breakfast, that the idea of this bridge that we do have to walk over, I think this is a really incredible start. I think the danger is thinking that this is the collective voice on these issues. And in fact, hearing people who are formers, hearing people, I have the names of Tanya, Taylor, Michelle, Richard, Dawn, and Nordeep written in my notebook, because I think, you know, there's a US Marine, and he started this interagency effort. We'll talk about it in a moment, and I'll end with that. And he said, you know, and he started a lot of his presentations in Europe with this. And he said, you know, there's a dad and a son having breakfast. And the dad said, you understand when you're eating bacon and eggs, the difference between being involved and committed. The chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. And I read these names of Tanya, Taylor, Michelle, Richard, Dawn, and Nordeep, and I realize there's other people here who, if we saw the presentations, and I realize it's such a horrifically difficult experience. Many of us don't want to walk over a bridge to the experience of having to get that telephone call. I watched Michelle and I looked at the pictures of her brothers, and so this topic is extremely hard. So to give you the answer you asked, Admiral Stavridis, another 4-star general who ran the European Command before I arrived, believed that you could not reach true peace and stability down the barrel of a gun alone. Pretty amazing thing for a 4-star general to say. But he put his money where his mouth is, and he created what was called the Interagency J9 at the European Command in Stuttgart, Germany, which was a collection of all the US law enforcement agencies, as well as the state cabinet agencies. A richer, more interagency team that than you see in any place in the world. I sat across the hall from US Treasury and Department of State. We had Department of Energy and all of the law enforcement officers, Customs, Border Protection, Homeland Security. We also had Drug Enforcement Administration. And we were a unit 15 deep, and we were charged with advising the commander and working across nonprofits, academia, the private sector, the public sector, with talking about the key issues with respect to security. I will say one of the early projects I had involved assembling a meeting with France, Belgium, Germany, and Netherlands to talk about the introduction of the millions of records that had been seized by the military in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq for use in criminal courts. I learned some very painful lessons of the politics of Europe, that those countries and those member states had never met collectively to talk about counterterrorism in one location. And I learned that quite pointedly from the Attorney General of Germany, who there's a lot of protocols you have to go through, and just how sensitive these issues are, and they were equally sensitive in our communities. And so what I would ask the organizers and the people, and the organizers I suppose are really us, right? Is that we need some strategic direction. We need to know, not just next year in Pittsburgh, because I really do hope to come back. I've had an exceptionally meaningful time, but what will success look like? And that interagency within the European Command had a strategic paper, it had a proof of concept. Each agency paid millions of dollars for their staff to be there, and they were held accountable to identify how they were delivering. And you can watch Admiral Stavridis on a TED Talk, which I think is incredible. And I'll close with this. After the events of January 6th, I received a letter from a German judge, a very senior judge, and he basically said, "This is a Sisyphean task. I have never imagined that I could see such events." And I was so disappointed to hear one of the smartest humans, I believe, call it Sisyphean to respond. And I feel like here, I had watched the special envoy, Miss Alice, say when she gets overwhelmed, she touches things in the room. Her dad taught her to look at what things were made of. And what I tried to do is I try and think of it as a practice. It's not the path to nirvana, and it isn't the top of Sisyphus' hill, because I think if we think about that way, we'll put our heads down and never really get anywhere. And it's not an end state. I think it's a discipline and a practice, and that may be something that here, many of us in the United States aren't willing to put that time in towards, it's like maintaining your marriage or your weight or anything else that's meaningful to you. So Laura, I will pledge to you that if there are 1,440 minutes in the day, I will give you at least 10% of those minutes towards this cause, because I think it's really important. And I would really ask for some direction. So if, and hopefully only, I will say when we come back in a year, we can get back up on the stage and talk about what we've accomplished. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we'll leave you with a few different deliverables. Laura, we have a number of different things that I think this group has talked on, both during this panel and beforehand. So I'll start with that. So Robin has really challenged us to develop a written strategic plan. And I think we have some that's already been in the works, but to really develop that and come up with what a win looks like here. And I think, Louisa, you mentioned the studying, you want more information to understand how misinformation travels. That's another potential idea. Tori, do you want to talk about the recommendation that you had for us as well?
Yeah, in Europe, we have something called the Radicalization Awareness Network, which is a network of practitioners from a broad variety of agencies and disciplines and civil society organizations, brought together with scholars, with let's say, practice-oriented researchers. And that is, they have a number of different working groups on different topics, and they also work across these working groups, and there is also a policy recommendation dimension of this. So I suggested that this is something they should also develop in the United States together with Canada, and I've been told that it's actually starting. So that is a good, the idea is already been here before me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I think with that, we'll conclude our panel. Thank you all for being here.